Tonight we're going to be talking about what is probably one of the most difficult topics there is. Some of the people in this room I know will have had personal experience with suicide. Some will have known people who had killed themselves, perhaps people close to them. There is no way in which one can talk about this act without touching people very closely. It touches all of us. It's sort of central and says something very important about our lives. And I hope this will come out in what I have to share with you. There is a kind of tension, a new kind of tension, a tension in modern life that is going to be very difficult to loosen. On the one hand, we have reduced the occasion of natural death, and we can quite literally offer most people an indefinitely prolonged life. And then, on the other hand, we have not found the way to offer everyone a meaningful life. We can't somehow guarantee that everybody will be able to make choices that matter, that everybody will be able to negotiate with some success for the satisfactions of needs. And so for increasing numbers of people in our world today, life approaches the unacceptable, indeed the intolerable. And when that happens, when all else fails, we have usually reserved for ourselves one choice, one last decision. Excepting for sometimes people in prison and sometimes people in hospital, we can always kill ourselves. And no one can stop us if we're really determined, if we're dead set on dying. For the people who are left behind, of course, involvement and complexity often and usually increase, with grief, sorrow, mourning of an entirely different order. And this is the principal legacy of those who leave life by their own act. There are as many ways to leave life as there are to leave a party that one is no longer enjoying. There are just as many reasons. We can swagger out drunken, roaring insults. We can slip out quietly, softly, unnoticed. We can dance our way out gracefully. We can make formal adieus, bowing and correct. Or we can make the sort of endless departure, standing in the foyer, always thinking of things we have yet to say. And so with suicide. It is not a simple, unitary thing. It's complex, manifold, and the subject of books and catalogs, and the provoker of many feelings and many responses. We might look for a while at some of the things that we think about suicide and the person who does this. The suicide is a cheat. This is clear. When a human being is on trial for his life, or when a man or woman is under sentence of death, execution of death, we impose elaborate suicide precautions, lest he cheat the hangman. And the suicide always cheats the state. He cheats the tax collector, he cheats the prosecutor, the courts. If he's young enough, he cheats the truant officer. He also cheats, whenever he can, the insurance companies. And there's growing evidence that a number of suicides are concealed suicides in order that the insurance companies might cheat. The suicide is a cheat. The suicide is irresponsible. Suicide represents the ultimate rupture of all contracts, the abrogation of all duties, the failure of all promises, the breaking of all appointments, saving only one. Irresponsible. Suicide is also the extreme of hostility. It usually destroys 2 lives, often more. It spoils many lives. And it's one of the few acts I know in which the angry actor becomes himself the object of his own destructive ire. It shares something of the pathos of the man who breaks his own fist against a wall in anger, or the woman who gashes her breasts, or the child who slaps his own naughty fingers. It's a pathetic act. It's also solipsism, The world exists because I am looking at it. The suicide says, your importance and your significance lie in my regard, and by my death I destroy you all. It is you who cease to exist. And suicide is, of course, the insult without parallel. What the suicide says, partly, is none of your delights, none of your silly toys, none of your rewards, none of your satisfactions are worth lingering for. The suicide weighs our life and rejects it, scorning what moves us, scorning what stays our hand from killing ourselves. Cleopatra was very direct in this. You recall she said, "Shall I abide in this dull world, which in thy absence is no better than a sty?" Or just early this year, George Sanders, the actor, brilliant actor, killed himself and left a note to all of us, an insulting note. He said, "Dear world, I am leaving because I am bored. I feel I have lived long enough. I am leaving you with your worries in this sweet cesspool. Good luck." It's an insult, this sweet cesspool. The suicide is wasteful. All of the efforts of parents and friends and teachers and lovers, all are tossed away without thanks. Talent, charm, the hope of yet to be enjoyed productivity, creativity, are taken from the rest of us. Something complex and cleverly contrived is reduced to its elements by suicide. Sort of like unraveling a tapestry or untying the knots of a piece of macrame and reducing it to a pile of string. And again, Cleopatra. She knew that her act would also this knot intrinsicate of life at once untie. Suicide is also the ultimate choice of free will, one last act of liberation. An act, of course, whose benefits are best reserved, best served, best enjoyed by keeping it in reserve, using it as a threat. Emily Dickinson knew this. She speculated beautifully about the possibility of killing herself. And she said, "What if I say I will not wait? What if I burst this fleshly gate and pass escaped to thee? What if I file this mortal off? See where it hurt me? That's enough, and wade in liberty. They cannot take me anymore. Dungeons can call, and guns implore. Unmeaning now to me as laughter was an hour ago, or laces, or a traveling show, or who died yesterday." But her perception of suicide was very different, when instead of contemplating the possibility of using her own as a threat, what if I say I shall not wait? When she had to deal with the perception of another's real suicide. And there, she said, he scanned it, staggered, dropped the loop to past or period, caught helpless at a sense as if his mind were going blind, groped up to see if God were there, groped backward at himself, caressed a trigger absently, and wandered out of life. And so, mostly reserving it as a possibility, or even as a right for ourselves, we tend to judge it very differently when it occurs in others. The state, curiously, regards it as a crime. In California in the 1920s, where I was growing up, suicide was a capital offense. You would quite literally, I suppose, go to the electric chair for killing yourself. In most states in the Union, it's still felonious. In Minnesota, since we revised the criminal code, it now is reduced to the level of misdemeanor. Yeah, but there's the rub. The suicide's assistant, who in many cultures, by the way, is honored. In Rome, the height of dishonor was having to kill yourself. If you couldn't find someone to hold your sword when you ran against it, but instead had to hold it and fall on it yourself. So the height of dishonor. The suicide's assistant has been honored in some cultures. In ours, he's of course reduced to an accessory after the fact and guilty, subject to all the penalty of the law. Psychiatry, rightly, often sees suicide as a form of mental illness, the product of madness, biochemical process, perhaps. But there, curiously, suicide is sort of the symptom that confirms the diagnosis and halts the treatment. The disease that is forever without a cure. The church has always required its members to believe that suicide is a sin. But the church is having to face some very difficult questions these days. If some caused and unnatural deaths are acceptable to the church, and if on occasion these deaths are even just and holy and good, may not other deaths then, self-requested, moved by pity, moved by mercy, also be free from sin? Shakespeare again. Then is it sin to rush into the secret house of death ere death dare come to us? Sometimes suicide excites our admiration. But the suicide that provokes us to admire does so only slyly and uncomfortably. And unless it occurs in another culture, Asia, or the Arctic, or in the oppressed nations, or in that strange and foreign country in which the poets and artists keep their residence. Otherwise, we're uncomfortable with it, even in our admiration. Mostly we don't admire. Mostly we see the things that most frequently move people to kill themselves or to threaten to take their own lives. Chronic futility, loneliness that can't reach out for love and companionship, stupid inability to seek other solutions to problems that can be solved, drunkenness, chemical madness, unassimilated pain of mind or body, and the act itself is so frequently pathetic and sometimes inept and clumsy. Another failure in a long line of failure. There's a splendid cartoon by Rodriguez, the classical suicide scene, the noose hanging from the chandelier, the stool or chair overturned. The man is dangling in the noose with his arm caught in it and his neck and dangling, kicking his legs, and his wife has just thrown the door open and crying out, "Can't you do anything right?" One more failure. And how quickly, by the world forgotten, lingering in family memories to haunt grown sons and to make grandsons uneasy. Recently, we've been concerned a great deal with human rights and see many human rights as being threatened. In our concern, we're talking about some very odd human rights. Hannah Arendt recently analyzed thinking as a subversive activity and saw thinking as being under attack and said we should be concerned with the right to think. We've heard some discussion recently about the right to remain unmarried, the right to remain childless, a very odd one. And in our concern with the right to self-determination, some have been talking about the right to make foolish decisions, the right to make meaningful, if wrong-headed, choices. And of course, we have seen recently a great deal of discussion about the right to die. We are concerned about this. Faced with the problem of pain, physical pain, mental pain, spiritual pain, the situation where life becomes intolerable, what then are our rights? Philosophy has attacked this problem, religion has attacked this problem, but neither has ever dealt with the problem of pain in a way that affords any relief to the sufferer. And the state hasn't done any better. The state's approach to pain is to reserve its own right to impose pain, to make life intolerable when it chooses. Faced with an intolerable life, there are almost always three solutions. We can run away, we can escape into intoxications, or we can kill ourselves. And the first two are specifically forbidden in hospitals and in jails, where life most frequently becomes intolerable. And so we're faced with the question of the right to die. It's sort of like other situations where we're concerned with human freedom, the right to make decisions even if they happen to be wrong decisions. You can compare it almost to the situation with regard to the use of marijuana or our legal approach to fornication. We seem to be unable to transform overnight what used to be a forbidden sin and a felonious crime into a matter of personal choice. And so we always go the same route. We start with laws defining fornication, marijuana use, suicide as a felony, and then we transform them to a misdemeanor. And then we decreasingly apply the misdemeanor law and the criminal statutes, and we hope we develop increasing understanding by the church. But this is the colonial trap. When an empire says that it will grant autonomy and self-determination to its colonies, as soon as they demonstrate that they have maturity enough to govern themselves, it doesn't work. It never works. None of us is very good at granting gradual freedom or at accepting it. And so the same is true of suicide and the right to die. There's a growing body of court cases, a growing body of decisions involving physicians and their patients, often initiated by the physician, establishing very slowly, but establishing the conditions under which physicians may cease efforts to prolong the lives of their patients. And there are indeed now in the world people who are working to establish the conditions under which we may exercise a stronger right and request our physicians to kill us, exercising by proxy our right to suicide, our right to die at our own hands. I think I can argue in favor of the right to kill oneself. See it as a right that should be reserved to every individual, that is in point of fact. But also I can argue, I think, equally strongly that suicide almost always is a wrong-headed act. It almost always is the incorrect solution to the problem. I would go farther and say it is always wrong-headed. It is always a stupid thing to do under any conditions. And therefore my approach as a psychologist, if you succeed, my approach then always is to try to dissuade. And therefore if I were arranging society, and you're lucky I'm not, counseling would be required for suicide, as counseling would be required for the decision to get married. And if people persisted in what I would perceive as a wrong-headed decision to kill themselves, I would help them do it well. And attempt to make it, as we attempt to make all deaths that we define as acceptable deaths, as we attempt to make it an appropriate death, authentic and meaningful. I would attempt to end the threat, the cudgel-like powers of threat that it involves, as a right perhaps that should be reserved for the individual. But this asks the wrong question, as we always do. And for adults who make their own choices, the significant question is never, shall I kill myself today? The significant question is always, shall I live today? Death is the natural state. Death is the end towards which the material universe is marching. Entropy is the goal of matter. Death is the natural state, and life is the unnatural state. The focal point where cold death is halted, the glorious reversal of entropy, complicating, increasing, aware, participating finally in its own evolution. Life always proceeds from the simple to the complex, and life always gets harder, and it always gets more difficult. And those who long for a day when it will be easy are deceiving themselves. Suicide rates go up with advancing age. Nobody ever has it made, ever. And life depends on death, even as it struggles locally and particularly to reverse it. Complicating, increasing, aware, participating. And like the murderer, like the executioner, and like the warrior, the suicide's only participation in life is to say no to it. And the rest of us participate in another way, in a kind of continuing revolt against matter, in a kind of continuing revolution against entropy. Each moment, even in poverty, even in disability, even in pain and decline, even so, as James put it, even so, saying yes to life. Afraid, often alone, unsure, stubborn, insisting, and demanding that other right, the right to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brantner. Now then, we have an opportunity for a coffee break, and there are a variety of panels and workshops to take part in. I beg your pardon. Including, if you'll look at your programs for a moment, suicide and the occult, stress and suicide, suicide intervention, a workshop in sociodrama, about which I know nothing really about sociodrama, except this is an extremely likely opportunity for some audience participation as a means to explore some of your own and society's attitudes toward the question of suicide through role play. And we're also having a workshop or a presentation on CHR. In the end, it's a videotape, documentary, and some of our staff are going to talk to you about CHR, what areas we work in, the history of the program, some of the needs at the present time, and so forth. Now then, the only panel that's meeting on a level other than this is the suicide and the occult panel, which will be meeting downstairs. As you go down, take a right, and then another right, and go back down the long hallway on your left. It corresponds to the one up here. There's a sign on a wooden standard saying suicide and the occult. The other panels meet up here. Stress and suicide, if resource people and those who are interested would move forward, please meet here. This is a large panel. Those of you who are interested in finding out about CHR, move into the East Commons. In the room on your left, first on the left there, the flexible room, the flexible dining room area, we're having a presentation on suicide intervention. The sociodrama workshop will be down this hallway at the end, the left-hand hallway, down at the extreme end. And if you're interested in coffee, that's over on this side of the room. By all means, as long as you need to get charged up. Give people time to move to the various areas. First of all, I'd like to tell you who your moderators are so you could kind of gather around them. I'll be moderating the program on suicide and the occult. Hank Helgen, if you'd stand for a moment, Hank, please. Hank is going to be moderating the stress and suicide group meeting here. Judy Parr. Judy will be moderating the suicide intervention panel meeting in that room in the corner. And Jim Ahrens, Jim, will be moderating the sociodrama workshop at the extreme end of the hallway. And I think that should about do it. If you need chairs, please feel free to move any of these black chairs back and forth on this floor. If you go downstairs and you want a chair, please take one of the folding chairs. And I think at this point that about does it. I want to say thank you all for turning out this evening. We're trying to run this program something like the co-learning model. We have resource people, but you are the most important resource people. Thank you.